the modern mind does not do well with liminal spaces. It's inherently unnerving. And I think that getting comfortable with not grabbing onto the unfolding and not feeling like the only way you're safe is if you know what's coming, like not coming from a control perspective. I think it's very unnerving for modern minds to uh, accept actually how liminal we are, you know? Even just our organism, like we're mostly non-human cells. Do you know what I mean? It's like we're in between all kinds of things, you know? So I don't know. Yeah, it's liminality is tricky.
Yeah, it's like having like enough solidity and enough rhythm to hold that process.
Yeah.
Um, which has been like a whole dance of like finding enough anchor points.
Yeah.
But it's what you said before around kind of becoming less and less human and more
Yeah.
other other kinds of perception and consciousness. Very much kind of feeling that, like the
Yeah.
edges.
Yeah. And that's a trip too, because you have to um I think that humans are fundamentally like I think any living being needs a sense of ordered space. You know, like we need that sense of ordered space to kind of keep the wildness and the chaos from overly disrupting our systems. And I think every living being, you know, we're all calibrated to different degrees of wildness, but I think any living being, like bears have caves and they're about as wild as you get. Birds have nests. You know, everything just needs that sort of space that feels slightly ordered and not so chaotic. It's why all of us panic when something new comes into the environment because we really need that ordered space. And I think that having that like unbecoming of your humanness where you're becoming something else is really difficult because we need to couple that with ordered space so that we can be safe in the like what am I trying to say? So we can be safe in like the unformed or the non-oneness of ourselves, you know,
Mm,
of like the individual ego. So we can feel safe being a multiplicity or feel safe being not just one identity and not in control of that identity. And I think that's why like spiritual practice and altar work and ritual structure and connection with nature are so important because they give us some structure that's different than like the control structure or different than like the hyper individuation ego structure. And finding those like different frameworks and different tools as you are just increasingly getting transformed, I think is really important. Otherwise it's like it can be really like whoa, whoa, you know.
yeah, there's something about like something the beings that can hold without necessarily looking directly at.
Hmm. Yeah,
So I think there's a way that like if it's looked directly at, it stops being
I
able
think
to.
that's really well said.
Yeah,
Yeah. And we're so addicted to like knowing that we're compelled to look directly at so we can decide. And then it kind of like the more expanded territory just gets obliterated when we do that, you know?
yeah, it's like the wild animal thing of it just
Yeah.
freeze and run away. Um, this actually feels like a really good kind of energetic segue because that's a lot of what relating with the Nornir and the well and the tree have
Okay.
kind of been like sensing into is the like the actual kind of relationship to organic time and how things grow and what the support for that is.
What do you mean? Say more.
Mm. There's still, and there's something about that kind of gathering of beings that feels to me like they hold something about primal intelligence and actual unfolding and like um, what we come into the world carrying, like each of us with our own dreaming, um, and then kind of the energetic support for that process.
Are you talking specifically when you say that those beings, are you specifically talking about the Nornir? Oh, okay. Okay.
That there's like my sense in relating with them is that there's some kind of like pre-Christian, pre-Viking, pre like all of the
Oh,
kind of
for
more
sure. They're
things.
very, very old.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm really curious what your own relationship with them is, and like whatever you'd like to share about.
Well, I think the first thing would be let's get oriented about so we're on the same page and we're both talking about the same people. And just to be because understanding the Nornir from like a linguistic and historical perspective really helps distinguish them from like the Moira in Greek who are like the weavers. So a lot of people say the Nornir are the weavers. They're not, they're carvers, right? So it's just and carving is hundreds of thousands year older as an art form of human expression than weaving. So that gives us immediately like a distinction of kind of understanding that these beings are really, 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 really old, right? So that's part of the thing. And then also with their names. So there's Uthir, Verdandi, and School. So Uthir, Othir is like she's the oldest, and people typically translate their three names as past, present, future, and that's not actually accurate, right? So Othir is she's the only Norn who is consistently sort of identified or held on to in all the different cultural permutations and understandings and relationships with the Nornir. So some people think that there are lots of different Nornir, like the Aesir had their group, and the elves had their group, and the dwarves had their group. Some people think that there's only one. Some people that there think that there's only three. So I think that like going into a spirit of forming relationship with them so that they can come to you and reveal themselves to you according to your own necessity of them or your own need for how to understand them is really important rather than having to say there's like this one way of knowing them. So if Othir is like what has happened and Verdandi is what is happening, Skuld is really interesting because Skuld is often talked about as what will happen, but it's more accurate to say what ought to happen, and it's even more accurate to say of what is owed. So if you think of that, of what is owed, um, that is to me a key of understanding the this particular um, body of fate that's revealed through the Nornir is really looking at everything that you're experiencing is very personal about the choices that you've made. So, like, what ought to happen to me is pointing to the fact that we are in relationship, that the importance of relationship with life and right relationship, and that when we are in right relationship, there's always an exchange. And when we're not in right relationship, there's always a price to be paid, right? So I think that there's a metaphysics that gets revealed that really speaks to humans to say that be not in right relationship at your own peril because you will owe something. And it really is like that rune, the Gabo rune, which is that perfect X. So the Gabo rune is about exchange, or it means the gift. It's translated as gift. But I think it's so essential to, if we think of the runes as foundational energies of the cosmos, so like part of they're the fabric of reality energies rather than like, further down the line. I think that the Nornir are very much fabric of reality beings. And so they're revealing a very profound truth. So Othir, like she carves each of us into the world tree, right? So we're carved. That we're not there's they're not weaving anything. So we're carved into the world tree, and one of what she's carving is the date of our death, right? So if you I think a lot of Western minds, like we tend to kind of cherry pick and mishmash according to our preferences rather than ask to be taught from what's actually there. So for me, um, I think that like understanding that Othir is like carving your name into the tree, and then there's what's happening, which you know, Verdandi, which are like your very lived choices, and then what's owed or what ought to happen, right, is really pointing to a very spectacular container for our sanity and our ease. So one is that there's nothing you can do about your death. You can't die before it's your time to die, and you can't not die when it's your time to die, right? So the ancient Norse people, their kind of cultural thing was like, I'm going to die when I'm going to die. So am I going to live as a coward or am I going to live courageously? There's nothing I can do. So opportunities that would present themselves, they would just go for it. Because they're like, if I die, I'll die in glory because not being a coward. And if I don't die, cool. But I have no idea when I'm going to die. I just know that I am. And nothing can disrupt Other's like carving, right? So it gives you this kind of psychological um, safety net almost in a way of like, just accept your fate. But that's the only thing that's like really set. And everything else is kind of mapping with the Nornir is kind of mapping the choices you make in relationship with life. And it's what's owed. So if life is giving a lot to you, you give a lot back to life. But if you've taken a lot, you have a lot is owed. Right. So it really speaks to this. It's very relational. Like for me, the Nornir and everything we learn just from their names is so metaphysically like revealing of the relational nature of reality. And yeah, so I think just starting with that as like so you understand how I like what my brain does and is like that's the container that my brain functions within when we talk about this kind of stuff. It's very relational. It's very like there is an inevitability, but the rest of it is how skillfully you're relational and how generous and intimate you are with life or not. And that whatever Schooled has in store for you, whatever she has in store for you is just because of your deeds, right? It's different than like some of the Greek concepts of fate or some other concepts of fate are very, everything is set and you have no choice. So I like this because it's basically like you're accountable for your life experiences. The only thing you don't have a say in is your death, but everything else you're accountable for. You have a way to participate within it, within certain variables. Certainly your ancestors influence um, the fate that you experience and things like that, right? And that's also relational, is that we're not just independent units. We also are carrying the choices of our ancestors. So that ties us into generational relationality, right? Like we live to make sure that our descendants don't have really gnarly things that they have to answer for or owe our debts. So it's just so brilliant to me about it's such a sophisticated, refined, nuanced understanding, and a lot of people don't think of any ancient peoples as having that level of sophistication and nuance. We all think, like, oh, we're the most advanced, right? But it was so tuned in and so profoundly sourced, and I think it's completely applicable today. So that's what I have to say about that. Did that make sense?
It does. I've been like
Okay.
deep diving into a lot of the language, the like literature around the Norns. So
Nice.
yeah, there are like multiple places I want to go now. Will you say, I feel like I kind of I have a sense of it, but if as other people are listening to, um, will you say more about what you mean by relational? What that feels like and how that expresses for you?
Yeah, I'm very, that's like everything to me. Um, so relationality, as I mean it, is when we break through the wall of delusion that we are individual and separate, but we don't break through the wall that separates us out and say everything's one. So there's a sweet spot between sort of overly blending and overly hyper individuating, right? And so that sweet spot is what's relational. So relationality to me is when we are tuned into the broader ecosystems of life from a like cells to soul permeated understanding that there's no hierarchy, that we don't hold a hierarchy with it, that life doesn't have a preference for us because we think we're superior. So there's no hierarchy. We're not supreme stewards of everything below us, right? Stewardship arises from a place of connected care when we say rescue a baby squirrel that's fallen out of a tree or do something like that. But stewardship that is promoted like in the Christian Bible and amongst more modern peoples is this idea that we're above and we therefore have dominion over all these things that are beneath us. So there's a really um, essential, when I talk about unbecoming, there's a really essential process for us to allow ourselves to discover what we are instead of decide or regurgitate what we've learned and impose that onto the world. It's about going and having enough experiences with the world where the world reveals itself to you, but it also reveals you within it. You know, so like spending time in nature and really experiencing the rhythms of nature and the sort of cyclical nature of time and the different beings. So I'll give you an example of what I'm trying to say is many, many years ago, this is 34, 35 years ago, I was living on 500 acres, no electricity, no running water, no vehicle, 3 miles from the nearest road up in high desert of Eastern Oregon. Lots of rattlesnake. There were, you know, cougars and elk and deer and just coyote and all kinds of, you know, animals. It's pretty rugged. It was an abandoned hippie commune. There was only one house, one cabin that you could still live in that I lived in. And one day I heard my dogs barking outside and it sounded like an aerosol spray can was spraying and the dogs were barking like going crazy. And I walked out and there was a rattlesnake coiled up we had a little, like a wood pallet with some wood stove stuff, just to keep, you know, wood handy close to our wood burning stuff. The dogs were going nuts. So I put them in the cabin and all I could remember at the time, it was a fairly young rattlesnake. It was probably, I don't know, 5 years old or something. But at the time, I remember I had in my head that when rattlesnakes make a home somewhere, they tend to stay. So if they stake a claim on a space, they tend to stay. So my first thought was, you're trying, like, I don't want you to think that underneath this pallet, which seems great, would be a good home for you. So I'm like, I can't have this rattlesnake endangering my dogs. Um, so I squatted down in front of the rattlesnake within striking distance and I closed my eyes because I figured if I could get myself to the point where I felt safe squatting within striking distance with my eyes closed of a rattlesnake, that it would create an atmosphere that would sort of be a more neutral territory between us as beings rather than adversaries. You know what I mean? So I sat there and I'm like, okay, I have to figure out how to communicate with this rattlesnake. So I'm saying all these words. I'm like, I don't think words are going to go through. So I got an image. And I'm like, I'm just going to send an image. And the image was basically the rattlesnake stays there and I get a shovel and chop off its head. That was the image. Like, I don't want to, but I'm going to have to kill you if you don't leave. Right. So I sat there and I sent that image. And I was sending an image of the snake going away. And I sent that image of like, and the feeling of like remorse that I would feel if that happened. And all of a sudden I felt like And I opened my eyes and the snake was gone and I never saw it again. And that that's an example of what I mean by being relational versus most people think of rattlesnakes as these, venomous vipers that are going to be very aggressive and harm them. And when you're relational, you enter into this space of what is happening between us rather than like, what are you? And imposing that and living from a preconceived notion. So it's a constant state of extension and taking feedback and reading the space rather than imposing our stories onto the space, whatever those stories happen to be. And I think that that's very hard for a brain to do because the brain likes to find patterns and stay safe. That's what it's interested in. So to get ourselves to the point where we move into our bodies enough to not have our brain kind of dictate our experiences so much and then begin to cultivate experiences. So I think a lot of people haven't, a lot of modern people haven't really grown up in nature, and the nature they've grown up in has been very tame, like parks maybe, or their backyard or something, but not actual kind of wild nature. And as such, I think a lot of us don't have uh, an innate sense of okayness with nature. We have this feeling of like otherness with nature. And so it kind of triggers our feeling of needing to be safe, which means we have to see things as friend or foe rather than being relational. And I think being relational also to me is recognizing that when you're not hyper independent, recognizing that the presence with another being like activates certain things in us and inactivates certain things in us. So if you get around somebody who, if I should say, if I get around somebody who is um, just very aggressive and whatever, I'm very fiery. It will activate that fire in me, and I'm going to be a different way than if I'm around somebody who maybe has a very peaceful kind of vibe, and then I'll be peaceful with them. Right. And I have observed that animals are very similar. Like animals are the same way. If they get around a person that is othering them, that person will not have an experience of communication and intelligence between the two of them. But if you get around an animal and the animal can tell that you're open to them as a being, you get quite a bit of communication, right? So um, that's what I mean by relational is really getting in your body from a place of curiosity and non-hierarchy. That's what I mean. Does that make sense?
Totally.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's so much about just like the level of conceptuality that like modern humans or Western
Yeah.
humans, the phrases like
Yeah.
live inside of, and that actual like the process of like rooting down and maturing into relationship with the body and
Hmm.
direct experience. Like, yeah. And also there's something about opening the relational pathways so that like things can actually happen instead of just sort of the top down story of.
Yeah, for sure. And also not, this is another thing though too, like a cautionary addendum would be understanding that modern humans, we are conditioned to presume access. We're conditioned to presume a level of knowing that we don't necessarily have. So a lot of people might hear, "Oh, I just need to be curious and in a state of like relationality, and then this animal won't hurt me." Right? It's like it doesn't work like that. So part of it is when we have a blind spot around presuming access, we don't really have the humility to go, do I have actual experience in this space? Do I have an actual track record with this type of being? Am I familiar with this environment? Like, how much do I actually know? And I think most modern humans presume expertise when they really have like just nothing. And then also presume that they can go into spaces that they actually aren't welcome. So they miss the unwelcome messaging and just kind of go in like I would not recommend anybody approach a rattlesnake unless they've had a lot of experiences with rattlesnakes and understand that they're very gentle, sensitive spirits who are venomous, very dangerous animals that will fuck you up if you're perceived as a threat, you know. And it's not about like you feel peaceful. It's about what are the two of you co-creating together. And I think a lot of modern humans are like they presume that like I'm in this space and therefore everything will cooperate with the space that I'm in. It's the centering of the self, you know, and it happens in just these really subtle and very insidious ways. And you have to have not only maturity and not only embodiment, but you have to have like an extraordinary degree of humility that I think a lot of modern humans don't have because we're indoctrinated to be arrogant. We're indoctrinated to be above. We're indoctrinated to be in control. And so I think real relationality is far more simple and far more, um, I don't know what, like non-extraordinary, you know, than I think a lot of people can conceive of. And we're looking to like do something and have like feedback that we have power, feedback that we're like, you know, magic, or feedback that we're something. And we're not being relational like in our spirits to not try and have ourselves fortified by the dynamic at all, but to really consider the other being as well, and to really consider how we're impacting that other being, not just what we're trying to get from it. And I think that so that relationality, the reason I'm saying all this is because I think a lot of times we conceptually get something, so we assume that we can do it, or we assume that we're there and don't have an ability to tell the difference. And the ability to tell the difference only happens with experiences where you're getting constant relational feedback about where you need to adjust dials and what you need to tend to in yourself in order to be in ecosystems with other beings in a way that doesn't disrupt their peace or threaten them, you know, to make them treat you like an other. Did that all make sense?
Yeah,
Okay.
it's resonating. It's like I'm feeling like the edges of threads connecting to things that I've been sensing into also, and kind of like
Cool.
listening for how to make the bridges. Um, yeah, there's so many layers. But yeah, that even like that piece around like how trees in the forest create microclimate, like what builds
Mm-hmm.
relationality is when there is a system wider than an individual.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and there's something about what you were talking about of like not completely merged or completely separate.
Mm-hmm.
Um, that and that's it's a navigation in each moment to
Yeah,
find the relationality is like relationality isn't static.
totally.
It is the dance. It is the
Yeah, totally.
and there's so this is and we'll bring in kind of some of my uh, kind of relationality with some of the it's like the patterns sort of connect in me in these different ways. So one way I've been sensing into Yggdrasil is this sense of well, actually, you've talked about it in different ways, like the this like energetic membrane,
Mhm.
kind of like in cranial sacral, they talk about people having a biosphere,
Yeah,
um,
for sure.
and there's something about that process of energetic maturation
Hmm.
to not be in kind of a threat response all the time, but actually have an ability to play and to connect and to find um, that to me it feels like there's something embedded within that pattern of Yggdrasil and the well that is holding an awareness of that. that process of maturation and embodiment.
So like a macrocosmic, microcosmic kind of thing,
Yeah.
like inferring from what it demonstrates that that's actually like natural and well for us to function that way or to conceive of things that way. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Yeah, that there's a way that that's holding the pattern of maturation that can be true for humans also, of like, and even just in traversing realms, also in moving through different energetic layers.
Mhm.
um that there's that sense of Yggdrasil as this primary pattern.
Okay. I've never thought of it that way. So I don't, nothing in me is like, no, you know, I hear that and I'm like, yeah, that totally makes sense, actually. I think too, you talked about traversing the worlds, and I think that it's one of the reasons I talk about how like rootedness is so essential, is
Yeah.
because I think a lot of us, like when we're not rooted, um, not only can we be knocked off our centers really easily, but we also are we read as unpredictable, right? It's very hard to get like a good read on somebody who's not rooted because they react to things outside of themselves rather than are responding from their rooting. And when you talk about traversing the worlds, I think that a lot of people who aren't rooted and traverse worlds, like whether it's journeying in Yggdrasil, journeying in those realms, or going to a different culture or going wherever, is that there's an insincerity that that is in us that makes us like seem sketchy, even if we're the best people on the planet, because we're not rooted. So people can't, like all beings can feel when somebody is rooted versus when they're not. And I think that traveling, like traversing realms, journeying, doing spiritual work, when you are not first really rooted, is actually quite dangerous because it makes us try to um, act like we belong in cultures. Again, that sense of access, right? To act like we belong in cultures or that we should be let into cultures when we really fundamentally don't understand them at all. And I think when you're really rooted, the sense of culture and the respect for culture and the ways that it causes us to experience the world differently from one another becomes so ingrained in you that when you do go into other places, so whether it's a forest or um, uh, Alfheim or one of the nine realms, whenever you go into those places, you're carrying an understanding of what culture does to us rather than acting like you just get to have the culture and when you're actually signaling wrong and you don't know what you're doing and making a big blunder. So it's sort of like, I don't know what your particular rules are, but I do understand culture enough to know that I'm going to be like curious and ask questions and follow your lead instead of come in with my stuff. And so no matter how culturally different we are, I could be present with you in our personhood, not necessarily in the similarities of our culture. And I think that without that distinction of rootedness and what that does relationally, as we move through the world is really important, because otherwise we are just we like the signal we send, it's like it makes us smell funny when we go places. Whereas like people can, like animals and people are just like, you don't smell right. Like even if you're dressed exactly like me, even if you've totally appropriated and all the cultural appropriation, but you didn't actually grow up with this earth teaching your cells, that the same earth that taught my cells, the same trees that taught my family. If you don't have that in your body, you just smell weird and you're acting like you don't smell weird. But when you're rooted, it's like you smell like a tree or you smell like the wind. You don't smell like a stranger. And it may be an unfamiliar tree, but it's still a tree. It may be unfamiliar, but it's not alarming. Like you don't seem like other. You just seem different and you don't smell bad. That's what rootedness does when we go into different realms or we go into different cultures, is that we're not emitting an odor that is othering us in the environment. Does that make sense?
Yeah, there's like an actual connection to essence and connection to, well, and also when I think about rooted, like what are we rooted in?
Right,
Like,
exactly.
and that people can be rooted in different things and different layers.
Which is why
Um,
so many of us don't get along. That's why I talk about, so in my book, I talk about ultimately we need to root into primal reality. Because if we root into anything else, we're not living in truth. We're not actually living in reality. We're living in stories. So yeah, thinking about what you root into and constantly seeking to root into what is real, and not focus so much necessarily on like truth and not focus so much on rightness, but focusing on what is actually real.
and that like the intimacy with what is peace that you also talk about in your book. Like part of this journey for me, there have been like so many moments of like, oh, it's actually like just coming into relationship with my body and like I have a migraine or like something, like actually being with whatever is in me in that moment, or whatever resistance or stuckness, or like I think there's like such a tendency to bypass or silo things
Oh, for
off.
sure.
And yeah, there's something about that rooting that is, it's actually like so much closer in and so much simpler than
Yeah.
a lot of people make it.
Yeah. And it's much simpler than the stories and the truths and the structures that humans invent. It's just so much more accessible.
And that's part of the confusion, I think, is that the the expectation coming in as creatures, like that other beings will be rooted in what is happening and what actually is, and then to be kind of in this abstraction from that, where so many people are the things that are creating threat or creating um, like how they're moving their systems are so pulled up from what is actually the ground.
Hmm. And it's disorienting and it's awkward and it's bizarre and it's confusing. And it's a very, yeah, it's a kind of communication system that isn't about belonging. It's a communication system that's about punishment, about being in or out rather than about actual belonging. Because, you know what I mean?
Yeah, and then the like what I've found and what holding space for other people in then dropping in is that so often there's this sense of abandonment or absence in trying to feel a sense of that wider reality. Like there's a kind of a having to move, or this feeling of being disloyal to the other humans in
Yeah.
thinking back in. Um, yeah, so yeah, that's um, another piece I wanted to bring in, which maybe fits here, is the sense of orlog. I don't know if I'm
Okay.
pronouncing it correctly, but
I say it or want to.
um, so the different translations, but primal law being one of them, and that the Nornir are laying down the primal law like strata.
Hmm.
Um, and there's something about that which feels like it really relates to the rooting
Oh,
process.
for sure.
And then the other piece that is this whole kind of etymological thread that I really enjoyed. Don't like the rest of the book, The Well in the Tree, but there's this like the first chapter feels very solid, and then the rest kind of goes someplace else. Um, that's the whole conversation. But the meaning of well, Brunner, or
Yeah.
however that word is pronounced,
Yeah.
having having as well as the quality of wellspring and sourcing, also having this quality of container. And
Hmm.
um, that piece feels, so there's something about the laying down of the strata that when I sense into it also feels like strengthening that container. and that what the well can come through.
Yeah, so um I'm like, I think containers are really important frameworks to, like, they're incredible tools, is to really think about containers. So you know the white picket fence? So the white picket fence is actually an Old Norse magical uh, system. So white picket fences don't do anything. Like, you can just step over them. They don't keep anything out. They have slots like it. So what they actually were they were used to sort of establish a magical space of Innengard, right? So they establish a space of, like, everything inside of this fence is safe and orderly and not threatening. And everything outside is Utgard, right? It's wild and chaotic. So by putting this fence up, we are creating an ordered space for ourselves to feel space. We're creating a container within the broader field of the wild. And I think there's a lot of wisdom in frequently checking in with yourself as you um, transform, of asking yourself about, like, questioning your containers, questioning the in and guard that you need for a particular lemon cayenne.
Water, but
Oh, okay. Is it in the lemon cayenne container? That's funny. That's the only one I can have because of the
yeah.
logo. Yeah. Um, but I think asking ourselves about containers and what kind of containers do we need and what kind of containers are good for us. So the more rooted you get and the more you become, like, literally transformed to be ever increasingly part of the ecosystem rather than just the human systems, the more that you transform, the more that Innengard changes for you. So your tolerance for wild spaces, what normal people would consider a wild space, could be an Innengard for you. And then also learning, like, this is also really good for sorceress practices, witchcraft or magic or whatever you want to call it, but sorceress practices where you're going to meet maybe more primal beings, or you're going into more primal spaces, or you're going into more ancient spaces, is to think about what kind of in guard you would need. Because again, that humility piece, it's like like I would not just ask to be dropped off in the middle of the wilderness in Alaska. That's way too Utgard for me. It's way too primal for my ability, right? So, but someone who's a trained hunter and they're a survivalist and they've been in Alaska their whole lives, they'd be like, "Oh, hell yeah, drop me off. That's going to be a good time." So I think that a lot of us don't think about containers being individually dictated. So we don't, and I think a lot of practitioners, like a lot of healers and a lot of therapists and a lot of practitioners, get external, like, exoskeleton structures that they try to impose on their clients instead of first ascertaining, like, how much in guard, how small and how far away from the true wilds does somebody need to be versus, maybe how close are they to it. So you're not treating everybody the same. You're really getting a sense of how much safety and orderliness does a person need to feel contained and well in order to do whatever they need to do for their growth, their healing, their wellness, whatever it is, their spiritual practice, their magical practice. And that sense of the well, I think, is very interesting because you have, like, the source of water. First of all, wells are often portals to the unseen realm, right? They're portals either to the underworld or to the unseen realm. And the amount of just never ending source coming from a well, and the container for it so that it doesn't just flood everything. And I think that's really important for our spiritual practices because the more connected you get, the more you need those containers, because as soon as you start to really plug into those deeper connections, you just tap into a stream that just bursts into your life, and suddenly there's too much energy. You're getting woken up with downloads. It's too much. And we don't really think about the need for containers and what kind of containers and what are best containers for where we're at, and how it's not what's the best container for the situation, it's what's the best container for you in the situation that you're in. And we too often prescribe containers for situations, not for the people that are in them, you know? And I think that's really important. And it's important for us to think about ourselves that way. Because there's this thing of like, oh, you're powerful, you go witch, you know, there's this kind of thing about, like, I see people talking about being a wild woman and like claiming their wildness and they're feral and they're all these things, but they're afraid of fire, or they can't talk to a rattlesnake, or they have no idea what the trees are saying. They can't tell when the wind is giving you a message about the weather. They can't sense any of those things. But they're like, I'm wild, I'm feral. So we've conflated our need for a feeling of like power and importance with words that indicate more um, primal relationship, and we're sort of taking that for ourselves rather than realizing like the more you get into primal relationship, the less you need the accoutrements of power, the less you need, you know, all of those little things. But it's just always like weird when somebody talks about how wild or feral they are and they have no relationship with fire. They have no ability, they have no like spirit allies that would allow them to go into, you know, otherwise very scary and dangerous places, not because they're powerful, but because their spirit ally is lending their protection to them so that they can do that because they have been in relationship for so long with this being that that being will help them do that, you know. But we've so emphasized the self, the power of the self. And it's like, I don't know, man, the most powerful people I've ever met are only powerful because of how deeply rooted and connected they are in the ecosystem. They're not individually powerful. It's like their power is because they're open up to those, they've opened to those relationships, if that makes sense.
Something about how the relationships over time create that container or
Yeah,
that
for sure. Well,
the bios.
they make the container mobile. It's like you go from an exoskeleton to an endoskeleton, right? So you still have this structure. I think most of us need the kind of exoskeleton version of a container. And I think that the more embodied you get, the more you move into an endoskeleton where you don't feel the need to be insulated and protected from life. You just need to be able to move dynamically through it in a sturdy kind of fashion, if that makes sense.
It becomes portable. Like
It becomes portable, yeah. Yeah, it becomes really portable.
there's something about how different cultures hold that knowledge of maturation or hold that knowledge of whether it's like becoming an initiated human or becoming an adult or like whatever that shape is.
Mm.
And then how without frames for that, modern humans are still in our own versions of that process, but without maps or without kind of an orienting to what's happening.
They have no container.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I think in many, you know, in many traditions, you're not even considered an adult until you're in like your mid 40s, you know, and I think that there's a lot of, I think it takes a really long time to figure out being in a body and to figure out being in a body in your particular culture and to figure out being in a body in your particular culture in a particular environment. I think it takes a really long time to have any genuine ability to deal, you know, and in a, you know, our culture is so hot for Western culture is so hot. I think most, it's kind of global now. so hot for being perceived in a hierarchical way, where you're perceived as having power, you're perceived as having expertise, or you're perceived as having something, regardless of like anything else, like uncoupled from anything else, that the goal is to be perceived as an expert or as a wise person or as a this or as a that. And, for me, any of these conversations, like a core to understanding any of this stuff is humility. And if you are expecting at 35 or 28 or even 39 that you are an expert, wise person, um, I think that it does a disservice because it means you're paying so much attention to upholding that veneer that you're not actually listening and you're not actually engaging, and you're like your priorities are backward. Like the priority should always be belonging, right? But we are so afraid of the world that we've made our priority safety, and we've made the way that we become safe is by through hierarchical means, having some perceived status or power or wealth or expertise or something. So we're so focused on safety that we wrap, because we can't admit that, because that would mean we're vulnerable, and we wrap that in power. And then we're not actually prioritizing and focusing on discovering what's actually happening. We're too busy telling everybody else what's happening, and it takes us out of that. So we don't mature, ironically.
And there's something about like whatever someone's kind of soul essence or creative vision is, or like whatever is dreaming through them from the wider body, is how I would say it. Like we will get, I know for me, like there's been this whole journey of like kind of getting the taste of the pattern or hearing it in different ways, and then being like, oh, I have the pattern, I want to share the pattern. But
Mm-hmm.
the whole process of starting to root feeding into that is like whole journey that goes all these other places. And
Mm-hmm.
it's like I mean it's almost like the nutrients actually have to kind of unfurl, and the seed has to get planted and like become the tree. um, but often we're just kind of trying to give the seed before it's actually been planted.
Yeah, and I think that the urge to share is really natural, and I think it's a really good thing. But if we're sharing from a place of like not with the intention to grow our root and not with the intention of relationality, um, then yeah, it's a distraction, or we're missing out, or we're spending our energy in places that aren't going to bear fruit or bear roots, right? But if you're sharing from the idea of like, if you're sharing from a relational orientation, then what happens is it's like you get something that feels true to you, and then you share it. And in the sharing, you're allowed to start to get real life feedback about how relevant or not that truth is for you, and real life feedback about what else you need to learn about this thing and what you don't know and how well it fits you. And you're getting really great feedback that can be useful to help you grow your roots, if we approach it relationally. So I don't view it like a grab and pause and go inward and grow. Not that you were saying that. Um, I think that sharing is really important. And I think that being honest is important so that we can get feedback from the world around us that helps kind of mold and shape us. It's not like, I think there's the idea of like, oh, what's your purpose and who do you want to be and what do you want your life to be like? What kind of person do you want to be? Is really promoted in a lot of modern thinking. And we have withdrawn our attention from the world around us, and we've put our attention inside of us. But if you extend your attention back in the world around you, then you're always getting feedback. But when you're getting that feedback in the modern context of being right, it can feel shameful and embarrassing, and like you're reticent to like just put something out there because you want to, look what I know, right? Versus I'm going to say this thing and share this seed I just got, and then I'm going to get feedback, and that feedback might reveal to me places that I'm immature. It might reveal places to me that I'm undeveloped. It might reveal places to me where I'm guarded. It might reveal places in me where I'm, delusional or whatever. It's really, really valuable territory that I think modern humans view as inherently scary because it feels so vulnerable to get feedback in the context of a system that's like, you suck if you don't know everything. You suck if you're not an expert. You suck if you're learning. It's like we punish people for not knowing and we reward people for knowing as if knowing is like means anything, rather than like rewarding people for discovery, rewarding people for the willingness to learn and be transformed by the feedback that they're getting from outside of themselves. Because when you get that feedback from outside of yourself, you begin to adjust dials that allows you to be received and a part of the ecosystem because the ecosystem itself is telling you what it wants from you and what it needs from you, rather than you go develop in isolation and you go inward and you figure out all your shit and you like work through your issues and you deal with your trauma and then you go ta-da and you come out and you're like, this is my purpose and this is who I am and this is what I'm doing. You're in a closed system, and so it doesn't do anything for your sense for belonging. It just aggrandizes your sense of your personal self, which is, there's nothing wrong with that. I think that's a very necessary stage. We're just not like, we make it like it's the end of the line, penultimate goal is like when you get to the place where you live your purpose and you're on top of your shit and you're in your power, is like that's the end point. And I think that's way early. I think that's way over here, this really early part of like actually getting to be relational and belonging and mature. So yeah,
Yeah, it opens up a whole other realm if that if there's like this much other movement that
I
can.
think it's just there are so many variables that we can't even map. And so working with the variables that we know impact us, like relationality, ecosystemic belonging, humility, maturity, tools, skillfulness, capacity, connection. If we work with the variables that we do know impact us at the most basic and important levels, then we can focus on those when there's other things that our brains can't necessarily resolve or understand or figure out. And I think that those things that arise in us, that arising for you is part of what is important, and it may not necessarily be an important thing for me. And if I don't understand it that way, then I might go, "Oh, I'm not sure," and let's see if we can create a truth. And that truth that we decide upon might actually obliterate your insight that is actually useful for your orlog or something. You know what I mean? And I think it's a really tricky place. It's a really like razor's edge in a sense because you could get ridiculous and make everything just really subjective and lose all sense of reality if you do that. Like, oh, well, that might be meaningful for you, but it's not meaningful for me. Therefore, we just don't even talk about it. We just go, okay. And then we don't get the feedback, that environmental feedback and that relational feedback we need because we're all just like, well, it's all subjective. Who knows? It's your thing, right? So I think finding that place where there's feedback and there's responsiveness and there's thought processes and there's grasping and there's all the things that we do within the container of just being curious and considerate and respectful of someone else's orlog. You know what I mean? So that we can coexist and still experience feedback, like relational feedback together, and not have this idea of truth coming in and erasing anybody or anything, but also not feeding into some people get a little irrational or somebody being really off and we can't feel the difference between them being off versus this is just a temporary rising that they need for to get them to pivot wherever they need to go. And that's another reason I think rooting is so essential, is because when you're really rooted and you're really centered in your own body, that deeper intelligence will inform those little moments and give you discernment. of this person's batshit crazy and you need to not feed this, or this person's orlog is expressing itself and please be respectful and make space for it and don't swamp them with your truth. That makes sense?
Yeah, I really like that. That like feels very soothing to
Mm,
so much of the conditioning in dominant culture.
yeah. Well, we're so like people are just like fighting who has the truth. Like people are kind of battling because who has the truthiest truth. I don't know.
And then it like, because the desire I have is like, so with what your orlog is and what my orlog is like, and whatever whoever else is in relationship, like what's the dance, what's the play, what's the song that wants to
Yeah.
be created?
Yeah,
Because
exactly.
the ecosystemic part that
Yep.
like each of us has our own expression in the ecosystem that can support that.
Yeah. And we so often don't even have those conversations with one another at just such a basic level of like, um, what do you feel like co-creating? Or just saying to somebody, this really doesn't feel good to me. Does it feel good to you, or would you like to talk to me about how we could change it? Or whatever. Like we don't have those sort of spontaneous arisings that are just very responsive. We go, oh, we're not really connecting, and I don't think I like this, and I'm not sure I want to be your friend anymore. I'm going to be passive aggressive, or I'm going to like put some psychological interpretation onto you, or I'm going to be judgy, or I'm going to withhold love, or I'm going to, get violent. I'm going to judge you, or whatever, rather than, oh, I'm noticing this thing. Are you noticing the thing? Yeah, I'm noticing the thing too. Do you like that thing? Not really. Would you like to try and change it with me, or should we just like say goodbye? you know, that kind of stuff. And I think it just allows for, you know, like a lot more breathing room for all of us. Like if you and I were to have an interaction and there's a certain part of it that I was like, hey, this particular thing is like tiring for me, or this particular thing is like really hard for me. Could we do the other things that we do really well together and maybe just not do that so much? Would that be okay with you? And if you said, well, that's actually the essence of who I am, so I can't leave it out. It was like, okay, well, could we can create a container around it? Could we maybe have that thing for 15 minutes instead of weaving through the whole experience together? So, you know what I mean? Just different ways that we can like love and respect and make space for each other and make space for ourselves in the systems that we're a part of by being curious and humble and co-creative and allowing the responsiveness. But you have to be relational so that you're getting the feedback and we can all adjust dials. And if we don't offer that or share that or express the tension or the awkwardness we're both feeling, then we don't get the treasure from that.
That feels like in the beginning of the conversation talking about relationality
Mhm.
that I love the inclusion of what is the person's orlog as the
Yeah.
navigation of that.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, like a lot of the sweetest kind of relational spaces that I'm in right now, like have that where and if it does if I schedule a time to see a particular friend and it doesn't align or something else comes up, like that trusting of the wider web
Exactly. Yeah.
movement, and that there doesn't need to be shaming or blaming or
Yeah.
like fear about it,
Yeah.
and that trust that the nutrients can come from multiple places.
Hmm. And also to be able to just speak your preference and like, I've had experiences with people where we're rolling along and a pattern starts to establish itself that like isn't interesting to me, and then I'll talk about it and there'll be agreements around, yes, we'll change that, whatever. And you might say that someone's orlog in that moment is that they're really wrestling with a particular pattern, and that particular pattern doesn't fit me or you or whatever, doesn't fit the other person, that it's also okay. I mean, I think that's the thing too, is like the concept of our own individual fates and having um, all these, we each have different variable sets that come from our inheritance and what the Nornir decide and choices that we make. And I think that when you have concepts like orlog in an interpersonal, like in a relational space, it means that you have a way of using discernment with somebody that doesn't pathologize or diminish them. And you have a way of using discernment with somebody that doesn't elevate or pedestal or, power trip with them. It just keeps the really toxic shit out because you can say there's this thing, but it's not like there's something wrong with you or with me. You know what I mean?
I just had a sense too of like in an, another translation of what the Norns are doing is like washing the tree with the orlog, like the clay and the water from the well, the roots of the
Mm,
tree. And there's something about actually like the nutrient, like giving the nutrients to Yggdrasil, and that supporting the rooting.
mm.
That
And isn't it Nidhogger who comes in and like eats the rotting parts of the roots to keep the tree? So that's the thing too, is it's like there's a whole
that
community, there's a whole community of
there's
being.
well, there's Havelgamir, and there's Mimir as
Yeah,
well. Yeah,
yeah. Um, and I mean, I think that's one of the things about when we're in I think ecosystemic language is fundamentally mythical and imaginary, like image based. And I think that's the thing about like seeking out the right tool for the right job. Like if you want to have healing, but I think most people have very low relational trust with other humans. So if you want to have healing, you really want to go into a mythological and imaginal um, tool set rather than like, let's do cognitive therapy and science stuff. Like you really need the right tool for the job so that because those stories and that imagery guides our spirit to truths and like doesn't have to run through the brain where our conditioning is. You know what I mean? So that we can have things become available to us and open up in us and begin to transform us without us even knowing or controlling the process.
and that the images can also have a direct relational, like, because I think there's a way to kind of conceptually relate to images, but then there's the actual experiential relationality
Yeah,
with them.
yeah,
And yeah, how transformative that can be to actually meet the beings who are holding those images. Yeah, it keeps coming back to that piece around like not going fully into merging or fully into separation, but it's like it's the dance. It's not
yeah. It's a
static.
total dance and allowing yourself to be danced with the fact of our liminality. We are individuated and we are completely like part of all of it. We're both. And like we get danced between those. And if you allow that to happen, if you allow deeper intelligence to dance you between those things and you don't it's like there's nothing to stress about, there's nothing to figure out, you just let yourself be danced and so like when you're really individuated, like there's no story about it. You're like, oh, this is great right now. I'm setting boundaries and I'm, having preferences. And when you're really watery and like mergy and like union with everything, it's like, oh, this is great right now. This is exactly what's needed. There's no idea that like of the ego and like there's none of those ideas matter. You just let yourself be danced and you're like, some moments I'm hyper fire individuated and some moments I'm hyper water and some moments I'm the air and the earth between those two. It's like, huh, okay. And then you don't have to decide, you don't have to have an identity crisis, you don't have to try and be anything. And I think that getting to a place where you actually experience the relief and the joy of that is it's like so nice instead of driving it all. I think it's preferable, but I also think you cannot do it well if you're being this way about it instead of really in your bones about it. Yeah.
And there's a wanting of that, but there's a whole other process to actually like letting that in and being with it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you so much for this
Oh, this has been
wide.
really cool. I appreciate you inviting me. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, this has been really cool. I knew we were going to have a good conversation. I just had no idea what it was going to be. And I'm like, I think that's going to be best.